This part 3 video explains how murders of members of God's church were carried out by top leaders and others based on my personal experience. Hello friends, this is Unmasked Truth with Harmanjit Saini, where I provide unique analysis of world events based on the unmasked truth that after surrender, Germany continued World War II clandestinely and became a killing machine. I also provide true news that you will find nowhere else. In part 1 of this series of videos, I provided a long list of murderers in God's church who are top leaders and ministers. I also briefly discussed what deceived and motivated the topmost leaders in God's church to murder their own members who were under their care. In part 2 video, I discussed how top leaders in God's church were deceived by German masqueraders in God's church to carry out the murders. Some members and ministers in God's church were tares or infiltrators and were German masqueraders. They had already carried out murders in the past and were helped by the masqueraders to achieve success in their businesses and careers. Then a conspiracy was hatched as described in part 2 video to involve more top leaders and ministers and thousands of members to make a commitment to the masquerader side by murdering a genuine member of God's church who was not a masquerader in exchange for protection during the Great Tribulation at the hands of a German-led alliance which will defeat the United States, British Commonwealth nations and Israel in a war and sell their survivors as slaves around the world. That is the Great Tribulation prophesied by Jesus Christ in Matthew 24 verses 21 to 22. The date of April 19, 2019 was set to carry out the murders church-wide, when God's church would be celebrating the feast called the Night to be Much Observed. This feast immediately follows the Passover. The Jews actually call this feast the Passover and celebrate it at the same time with a special meal. I was one of the intended victims during this feast on April 19, 2019. During this feast, families get together in groups of 10 to 20 to have a special meal. I had been attending this annual feast at the home of long-term members Jack and his wife Kathy Fike for about 10 to 12 years. They used to invite the same group of 10 to 16 people annually for this feast during the 10 to 12 years I was invited by them. Jack today is in his 80s. On April 19, 2019, I was also invited, but the feast was held at one of the elderly ladies who was a regular attendee at Jack's home. Jack and Kathy were there too. In addition, our church pastor Doug Wendt and his wife also attended. Doug Wendt had just moved to our area as a pastor a few months back. There was also something unusual about one lady who attended. I had never seen her at church before. It was explained that she belonged to another area. There were 10 of us total attending that evening. This was an unusual meal. Normally we have a good meal with a good amount of meat of many kinds. This time the dishes were mainly vegetarian except one or two meat dishes. All our group know that I usually have salads and fruits which provide the fiber my body needs. Because there was a limited amount of meat, they knew I would eat the meat dishes also, and also the salad without oil and cheese, etc. We ate a meal, had some conversation, and I went home. I survived this attempt on my life. The lady I had never seen before had been used to bring poisoned food designed to kill me. The others never ate the poisoned food. They all were in on the conspiracy to murder me on April 19, 2019, when elderly and sick church members were poisoned to death to meet the masquerade hurdle qualification to join their side and make a commitment to them. This was done at other people celebrating this feast in their homes or other places. My own church pastor, Doug Wendt, who was supposed to be the bishop of my soul, actually conspired to murder me. Masqueraders want to make sure that church members are not faking that they made the attempt on my life. That's why a lady from the outside attended. They knew that she would make sure the meat dish she was bringing in was poisoned. That's how murders were carried out on April 19, 2019 at many locations. The intended victim was invited to be part of a group of 10 to 40 strong, celebrating the night to be much observed feast. A poisoned dish or dessert was brought and would have been served only to the intended victim, who was likely sick or disabled and probably a single person. So the poison dish was brought to him. Or all the others would have known which was the poison dish and avoided it, which only the intended victim would have eaten, later fallen sick and died of it. By this time, the editorship of church monthly news magazines had been taken over by the masqueraders or conspirators, and the deaths of the victims were not reported in the church news. During the night to be much observed in 2020 and 2021, I did not go anywhere due to the COVID-19 pandemic. But for the same feast in 2022, held on the evening of April 15, I was not invited by the Fikes. Instead, I joined a large group of about 40 to 50 of us at our church hall and had a catered meal, brought in by an outside caterer. I would have expected Doug Wendt and his wife to have the meal in their home or at the home of another member with 10 to 12 attending. However, he kept the feast with our large group. This time, the outside caterer made sure that I was served poisoned food. She herself cut the meat for me from a separate slab. Then, some members handed me my dessert. I let them do it because I was not suspecting anything. But that dessert was also poisoned, and also the meat handed to me by the caterer was poisoned. For part of the time, Doug Wendt sat next to me. He knew what was going on. Again, the bishop of my soul, my church pastor Doug Wendt, was in on the conspiracy to make an attempt on my life and sat next to me. I did not suspect that I was poisoned on April 19, 2019 or on April 15, 2022 because I survived. But just a couple of weeks ago, I began to suspect that this had been happening. My sources then confirmed that my food was in fact poisoned to make attempt on my life on both dates. Those are some of the ways genuine members of God's church were murdered on April 19, 2019 and perhaps some on April 15, 2022. Let this be a warning to genuine members of God's church to be very careful. I hope I have kept my promise to explain how Doug Wendt is the star of this video, but that is not the whole story. I was curious to know if Doug Wendt had committed murder before the attempts on my life beginning on April 19, 2019, committed murder earlier to get help with his construction business, perhaps decades ago. My sources have confirmed for me that he had indeed committed murder previously also. That is how this wicked man is, Doug Wendt. As I said, I realized only a couple of weeks ago that all these men were making attempts on my life during the night to be much observed feast. I was absolutely shocked to learn that there is another star of this video, about half a notch higher than Doug Wendt. That star is Jack Fike himself, the man in his 80s who invited me to his home for this feast about 10 to 12 years. I have learnt that during the 10 to 12 times I attended the night we much observed feast at his home, they had been making attempts on my life. Perhaps they had made attempts 5 to 6 times at least. The pattern was the same. They knew that I have salads and fruits for fiber. They would bring one such dish poisoned, which they knew I was sure to have. In addition, someone usually attended the group for the first time, and once or twice rank outsiders. I have confirmed from my sources that attempts were made, in fact, made on my life at Jack Fike's home by poisoning my food during the same feast. Jack Fike is at the same level as Doug Wendt because he too committed murder decades ago to be rewarded with a steady good job throughout his life. But you may ask, how is Jack Fike a half notch above Doug Wendt? Because Jack Fike is faking his early onset of Alzheimer's. He is claiming that he and his wife is claiming that he has a loss of memory. He has no loss of memory. He is faking it. He started faking it when he stopped giving sermons at church a little more than a decade ago. It's an old masquerader trick to fake sickness and disease or insanity to try, or being not of sound mind, to try and escape punishment for the wicked deed of murder committed decades ago. Let me repeat. One of my purposes in preparing the series of videos is to warn genuine members and members of God's church to be aware, to warn genuine ministers and members of God's church to beware of murderers in our midst. They will likely murder again. I'm in the process of identifying all the murderers so that you may know who they are. Unfortunately, every hard minister in the United States in the United Church of God is a murderer, most of them having participated in the murders on April 19, 2019, though 30 to 40 members and their families would have been gathered together where only one member was murdered. But they were all there to take credit for it and cement their commitment to the masquerader's side. Since they were all in on the conspiracy, they are all equally guilty of murder. Now here are the additions to the list of murderers which I provided in part 1 video. These are all United Church of God members: Ray Clore, Dan Preston, Chuck Smith, Charles Melier, Ariana Del Signor, Jim McTiernan, Paul Leakey, David Register, John Pinelli, Matthew Seif, and John Pinelli. These are all from Church of God Worldwide Association, or COGWA. Then here are more United Church of God ministers: Matthew C.F., Grant Chick, Tim Pebworth, David Payne, Michael Erickson, Wayne Ward, David Shriver, Michael Fike, Vivian Botha, Gary Smith, Jeff Richards, Joe Dobson, Andy Duran, David Jones, Craig Scott, Don McCoy, Nathan Ekema, Scott Buchanan, Gerald Oust, Philip Oust, Steve Myers, Dave Myers is in COGWA, then John LeBisnier, Gary Petty, Stephen Clark, Rainer Saloma, Patrick Reed, Fred Nance, Johnny Lambert, Nick Lamoureux, Dan Deininger, Jay Ledbetter, Stephen Brett, Rod Foster, Devin Schultz, Richard Kennebeck, Skeet Smez, Robin Weber, Troy Phelps, Louis Van Ostel, Steve Newtsman, Jim Tuck, William Bradford, Mike Phelps, Ed Dowd, Rick Beam, Gary Beam, David Dobson, Monty Knudsen, Tim Martins, Frank Fish, Mitchell Knapp, Aaron Creech, Joshua Creech, Paul Moody, Scott McKeon, Steve Buchanan, Randy Love, David Jones, Nelson Arnold, Kent Foraker, Kevin Kennedy, Doug Collison, Kirby W. Burton, Kevin Call, Greg Musgrove, Randy Weiler, Craig Clark, Kent Scorseth, Greg Thomas, Ron Barker, Ryan Hall, Tom Kniver, Dan Taylor, Rob Slocum, Rock Corbett. All of them are United Church of God ministers. Then Ryan Malone, Jim Mice, both are Philadelphia Church of God. Then our former pastor in the United Church of God, that would be David Trebig, and his brother Ken Trebig, and Mark Winner, and Vince Simkoviak. All these are COGWA ministers. So now you have a much more great list of ministers who committed murder that we have to be careful about. Again, I am putting all this on my in text form on my Facebook channel. I will continue to identify more of them in the coming days and weeks ahead. Thank you very much for watching this video. Please continue to watch my videos on important world events, World War III watch, politics, international business, how Bible prophecy is playing an important role in world affairs, advice on health and medical problems, and much more for in-depth and insightful analysis. Please also subscribe to my YouTube and Facebook channels Unmasked Truth with Harmanjit Saini to view and get information on the latest videos.